Hey, good morning and welcome back to the garden. Today's video is all about how to save time, so let's go ahead and jump right into the first tip. Over the last couple years on this channel, I've talked a lot about how much I enjoy growing in these fabric grow bags. That's what this Malabar spinach that's kind of colonizing this poor fig tree is growing out of. And the reason I like these fabric grow bags so much is they have some sort of unique traits that make them a really effective container for a lot of my favorite summer plants. They drain really well. Sorry about the chicken noise. When they see me, they seem to think that it's treat time. Anyhow, these fabric grow bags, they drain really well, they never get waterlogged, and they allow a lot of oxygen to reach the roots. And so, if you have the time to use them properly, they work really well. But realistically, those same traits do require a little bit of extra time from you as a gardener. Because they drain so freely, you're gonna have to water these more often. You're probably gonna have to feed the plants more often because you're losing more nutrients through all of that drainage. So this year, we're not getting rid of our fabric grow bags, but we are replacing some of them with these short galvanized steel raised beds. Because of their size, these raised beds are a good, easy replacement for the fabric grow bags that I already had in this area of the garden, for our container toddler garden as we refer to it. And because, as I mentioned, they're very short, they're really good at retaining moisture. A single line of emitter tubing running over the top of these keeps them adequately moist, even for thirsty plants like cucumbers and melons and winter squash, those plants that typically you're gonna have to water a lot, those plants that with the fabric grow bags I might have to hand water even if they're irrigated. Just remember that the taller the raised bed, the harder it is to keep it adequately watered. You're just fighting against gravity at that point. There's not a lot you can do about it. Plus, these shorter ones are much cheaper. Not cheap. They're more frugal. Some of our favorite crops are like this beautiful zucchini plant right here, in that they actually do better if you are planting them multiple times throughout a single season, meaning ideally I would be planting this zucchini here, letting it grow up, getting a nice harvest out of it, pulling it out of the ground and replacing it with another new seedling at least once every summer, maybe twice, maybe even 3 times, depending on the length of your season and depending on how long your plants stay healthy. And that's gonna be true of a lot of plants, right? Things like lettuce and determinate tomatoes and cucumbers and even these bush beans back here, they all fall into that category of plants that do better when they are succession cropped. But realistically, at least in my garden, that's a ton of extra work, because growing really healthy seedlings is the most important thing you can do, and probably also the most time-consuming thing you can do. So if you'd like to streamline your garden a little bit, one thing you can do is prioritize those long season crops, right? Things like kale and Swiss chard in the cool weather seasons, things like peppers and eggplants and indeterminate tomatoes in the hot season. Those plants you can plant once and harvest from over months and months, many times, and you're still gonna get a nice harvest at the end of that season. All right, take a look at the rows in this garden area, and you might notice that they appear to have been designed almost intentionally wonky. They are different lengths, different widths, different spacing, but beyond just looking odd, and trust me, they do look a little bit odd, more than a little bit odd, they're a big pain to manage. They take a lot of time to manage because each one of those rows requires a different amount of compost. Each one of those rows requires a different amount of fertilizer. None of them match the width of our tools, making bed prep a longer and more time-consuming process. Also, on the planting front, each one of those rows can fit a different number of plants width-wise, meaning I have to go out there and really carefully figure out exactly how many plants I need to start, and that takes a lot of time as well. Overall, when we're talking about the whole garden, it's just a big time suck. It's a big time waste. Now, on the flip side, consistent, uniform beds like these ones that are the same width and equal distance apart on every side are super easy to maintain. I can quickly add the right amount of compost, the right amount of fertilizer, because, well, it's mostly all the same, and I know exactly how many plants can fit side by side on each one of the rows in this area of the garden, so I know exactly how many to grow. Saves a lot of time. That consistency, that uniformity doesn't just save me time, it does save me a lot of time, but it's also just more fun to garden in because I get to spend my time gardening instead of planning. Hey there, apologies for the interruption. I'll keep this one brief in keeping with the theme of the video. If you are enjoying this video, if you think it's gonna save you some time, would you mind hitting that like button for me, the thumbs up real quick? Really, I very truly appreciate it. Thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for watching the video. Let's get back to those gardening tips. In recent years, strategies like no-dig gardening have really changed how us home gardeners prep a new area for vegetable gardening, and I think they've saved a lot of folks a lot of time. But one tool that still seems to go criminally underused is the humble cover crop. Let me show you what I mean. This little bed right here is full of a mix of different cover crops, as well as a few flowers like this sunflower coming in my toddler planted because, well, you got to keep it fun, right? But basically these cover crops are just pulling triple duty for me when I want to get a new bed ready for the following season. And this is a new bed. We've never planted anything in here other than these cover crops. The first thing that they are doing is they are just decompacting the soil simply by growing roots in this area. And that's important for me because I have a really, really compact soil. They're also a great source of green manure. I'll let most of these only grow a little bit larger, and then I'll cut them down, and I'll basically just mix all this material right back into the soil in place, and that's going to add some organic material back in, and it's also going to add a little bit of nitrogen back into that soil. And then some of those cover crops will let them grow to a more full size, and then I'll chop them down and cut them up a little bit and just use them in place as a mulch. And this mulch is really nice because it lasts about one full growing season. Over the wet, rainy winter season here, this will decompose and again add a little bit of organic material back into the soil, but in the meantime, it's doing a great job of helping retain some moisture on this zucchini bed. Before we move on to the next tip, I do want to give my usual caveat about cover crops, and that is, while they save me a lot of time throughout the season, and I really do feel like they save me a lot of time and energy throughout the season, they're a huge pain to deal with on a given day at the end of the season when I have to cut them down and remove them. That's just sort of the reality of it. So make sure that you are planning ahead of time on how you're going to get rid of them and that you have the time to do so. Again, it's a whole bunch of work on one day in order to get rid of them, in order to save a whole bunch of time and energy throughout that season and get better soil out of it. So I think it's a win overall. I just want to be transparent about the realities of planting cover crops. Until recently, all of the irrigation in my garden was pretty much custom. It wasn't complicated, but it was custom. I was using blank tubing and little emitters, right? Spaced out emitters and little sprinkler heads. And honestly, it was a nightmare. The problem with that custom setup was that every time I wanted to make a change in the garden, move a plant, add a plant, change the spacing, I had to compensate the system to make it work with that new layout. And I was doing that all the time. So it was taking a ton of our time, and it wasn't all that reliable or effective anyways. But I learned over the years, at least in this climate, that I couldn't get away with our large garden hand watering. It just wasn't going to work. The plants didn't end up very healthy. They weren't very productive. I needed irrigation in place. And then I discovered a couple of years ago that the pre-drilled emitter tubing that I'd always written off as sort of gimmicky was actually very affordable and very reliable. So this stuff right here that I have over all of my raised beds is basically just a line of tubing that has been pre-installed with emitters, and those emitters are at specific intervals. This stuff is at 6 inches, but you can get them in different options, and the water comes out at a predetermined flow rate. This is ½ gallon per hour, and it's wonderful because once you have it installed, you do still need to know how to install it properly. It's not going to save you from that. But once it is installed properly, it's just reliable. You don't have to think about it very much. It just does its job. And what I found is my plants have never been healthier. You know, I really enjoy getting out into the garden in the morning and hand pollinating my flowers, particularly the tomato flowers, the peppers, the eggplants, and they really benefit from that. That's how I get that almost 100% fruit set. It works really, really well. It's also just a nice way to kind of connect with your garden in a quiet time in the mornings if you have time to do that. I really enjoy it. But obviously that's not always feasible. It's super time consuming, and I suspect next spring I just won't be able to do that as much. But I don't want to forego those really big harvests that I've become used to by doing that. So one of the things that you can do, of course, is bring lots of flowers into your area in order to attract pollinator insects. But unfortunately, I think there's a little bit of misinformation out there about exactly how beneficial that is, how effective that is. You are going to get some marginal benefit from bringing in lots of flowers and bringing in pollinator insects, but it's not going to be as good as hand pollinating your plants. In general, there are exceptions to that, but in general. And then B, there's a little bit of, I think, misinformation out there around which types of plants, which types of flowers are going to bring in the right types of pollinator insects. You really want to pay attention to which plants in your area are bringing in those pollinator insects, or just look it up. There are a great list online for every area, every county, of what the most important pollinator insects are and what types of plants they gravitate to. For me, what I have noticed in our area is I really want to attract bumblebees, and the bumblebees really love those low maintenance, drought tolerant plants like rosemary, like Spanish lavender, like the Ceanothus, California lilac. Even English lavender works well, certain sages. Those plants do an amazing job of bringing in bumblebees, and those bumblebees are the primary pollinators of my vegetable garden, other than me in the morning with an electric toothbrush. Anyhow, I digress. Don't get me wrong, I love annual flowers, but before you go out there and you buy tons of annual flower seeds and you dot them throughout your garden, unless that's what you want to do because it looks beautiful, in which case you do you, definitely not a bad idea. Just make sure that those flowers actually attract the types of insects that are going to help you get more fruit set. Not all of them will. I'm in the tomato garden right here, and you can see that they are planted into a super tall, super thick bed of compost. This is sometimes referred to as a deep compost bed or deep compost mulch. And we've got about 4 inches of compost currently piled up here on the rows relative to the walkways. And it probably was a little bit closer to 5 or 6 inches at the beginning of the season before, we lost some to erosion. Now, there are a lot of things I don't necessarily love about this kind of bed. They were a lot of work and pretty expensive to install. They're a nightmare in windy weather. They're terrible for direct seeding in, but this right here, this does save me a lot of time, mostly for 2 reasons. One, this does a phenomenal job of releasing nutrients into the soil slowly over time, reducing how much I have to feed those plants. And then 2, for deep-rooted plants like this tomatillo right here, this deep compost does a tremendous job of holding in the moisture. The first couple inches dry out really, really quickly. We actually just ran the irrigation, so it's nice right now, but within a couple of hours, this top layer is just gonna be completely dry because you can see how loose it is, right? This dries out super quickly, but because it's so deep, down 2-3 inches, it's actually gonna hold in a ton of moisture, and that really helps these big plants stay nice and healthy throughout the entire season, especially in a brutally hot climate like ours. Now, to be clear, I do not think deep compost mulches, deep compost beds are for everyone. I think they have a lot of downsides like I talked about, but if you want a more self-sufficient garden, if that is one of your biggest priorities, I do think they're worth trying. Maybe experiment with them in part of your garden and see how it goes. I will say that they give the most benefits in year 2, in year 3, so give it a little bit of time if you do try experimenting with them. They do save us a lot of time. This plant is well and truly ready to go into the ground. It's probably been ready to plant for at least a month at this point, but we're sitting on it because I want to wait until our summer temperatures, until our summer heat waves have kind of subsided down. If I were to put this into the ground today, I would have to water this little plant every single day. Or if I wait a little bit, if I wait until late summer or even all the way into early fall, I'll only have to water it about once a week. And then pretty soon the rain is going to do the job for me and I won't have to water it at all until late spring next year. And the beautiful thing is, even as those temperatures soar up into the triple digits next year, this plant is going to have a nice, beautiful, established root system, and we're still only going to have to water it maybe once a week, as long as we're doing it properly. Combined with, say, the 20 other perennial plants that we'll put into the ground this fall, that saves me a ton of time. So I love Brussels sprouts, right? They're one of my favorite things to cook. They're one of my favorite things to eat, but I don't grow them in the garden because plants like Brussels sprouts and cabbage and cauliflower, most types of broccoli, get absolutely destroyed by our local pest populations here. So instead, I grow other things that I also really love. Here we've got a tray of collard greens and kale, and realistically, these are gonna suffer from the exact same pest as those Brussels sprouts. But the difference is, because these are leafy greens, cut and come again leafy greens, these are gonna bounce right back and still give me an amazing harvest, and a harvest that I get to enjoy growing. All the time, because of this channel, I get to hear from gardeners and what their challenges are. And I often hear from gardeners that frankly don't really seem to be enjoying their garden because they're trying so hard to grow a specific plant in the face of overwhelming pest pressure. They're out there in the middle of the night trying to pick caterpillars by the light of the moon. They're spraying chemicals that they're not really comfortable with. They're laying down insect netting galore over their entire garden space. And most of the time, or at least a lot of the time, I don't think it's worth it. Put that time, put that energy, put that money, put that mental space into growing things that you love growing, that do well in your area, and choose those really, really difficult plants to just buy at the grocery store or buy at the local farmer's market. That's my philosophy on saving some time this year anyways. Unless your problem plant happens to be tomatoes, in which case, well, you just gotta do what you gotta do. Thanks for sticking around. I think for the next one, we'll do a video on how to sow carrot seeds. That's kind of what I'm excited to talk about right now. I really hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it saves you some time in the garden. And until next time, happy gardening, y'all.